Regular viewers of my channel may remember that a couple months ago I had some back and forth with Anthony Costello. He is the director of the Kirkwood Center for Theology and Ethics, and we went back and forth on genocide and Joshua, the book of Joshua, Old Testament biblical ethics more generally. Costello was raising some objections to things I had said, and I offered critical responses in 4 videos. Well, he later on he posted this video, which I've just seeing today, and I wanted to offer some response to some things he says here, reflecting on that exchange and offering some criticism of me. So I'm going to play that clip and then offer my responses.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I was pointing out about Randall, without getting into the weeds on the defense of or the theodicy for the Canaanite conquest, which is a difficult theodicy. It's not easy. Nobody's saying it's easy to defend the harem, right? And that the harem is just something we can easily read through in the scriptures and be like, oh yeah, that makes total sense. But Randall was pulling something, and I think this is going to lead us into this discussion we're going to have on what we're going to call the bad faith portion of some progressive Christian voices out there, where he was not only just challenging Clay Jones's defense or William Lane Craig's defense of the Canaanite conquest or other conservative evangelical apologists like maybe Mike Licona or Frank Turek, etc. He was almost saying that if one defends the Canaanite conquest, which of course he calls the genocide of the Canaanites, and one is conservative Christian, a conservative evangelical, and especially if one has voted for Donald Trump, which is very obvious in Mike Licona's case, you know, the implication here, and I mean, he really is making this. One would have to go watch the videos, that those who make these defenses are basically genocide defenders. They're genocide apologists, and that's a term he uses several times. They're apologists for genocide, as if to say, not only are they defending this one incident, this unique historical event in the Bible, which we all admit is difficult, but they're sort of open to genocide, right? And so I was pushing back heavy on that.
Okay, that's what I want to respond to. I don't know if I'm going to address the part where he talks about Donald Trump. Well, I'll come back to that a little bit, but that's really a distraction. The main thing that I take Anthony to be objecting to here is using the term genocide apologist to describe people who I believe are defending genocide. Now, it seems to me that this is a simple semantic issue. If you are offering an apologetic defense of action X, you are thereby an apologist for action X. But let's unpack that a little bit further. First thing I would want to say is Anthony admits in that opening sequence, in a part that I didn't play for you, but he admits that he's only read of my published works one essay that I wrote, I don't know, 16 years ago. He's not read my book, Jesus Loves Canaanites, which, of course, is my 360-page explication and defense of my views. So that's a little bit of a limitation. Now, obviously, somebody doesn't have to have read all your writing on a particular issue in order to have a critical interaction with you, but it's certainly going to place that person at disadvantage when they don't really understand what you've argued or why you've argued it. Having said that, I think we need to begin with a definition of genocide, because this clearly is a trigger. I've seen that time and again. This is a trigger for people like Anthony, or I suspect others, Paul Copan and William Lane Craig, et cetera, the people he mentioned, that they don't want to be associated with genocide. They don't want to be tainted by genocide. And for good reason, because genocide, most people recognize, except when the apologists are talking, it is a crime against humanity. It is intrinsically evil. So we need to define what genocide is, and then we'll have a good sense on when a particular action or a defense of a particular action is genocide or genocide apologetics. Here is the definition of genocide from the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, the United Nations Declaration 1948. There are two things I want us to appreciate here: the end and the means. First of all, the end or the essence, the goal of genocide is to eradicate a genos, a kind or type of people. So that's what this begins with, the definition of the core idea, the end or goal of genocide. It says, in the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. So genocide is different from mass killing, for example, because in mass killing, you may just be randomly killing individuals, and the goal is to kill just those individuals. With genocide, the goal is not simply to kill individuals. In fact, it may not be to kill any individuals. Rather, the goal of genocide is to destroy a particular identity. So that's the goal, the end. Now, then we come to the means, which is listed in 1 through 5. So the different ways that you can go about attempting to destroy a genos, a kind of thing, a kind of people, is through number one, killing members of the group. Obviously, that's one way. Second, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, like engaging in a kind of psychological terrorism or torture and threat, etc. Three, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. For example, like cutting off the water supply to a city or forcibly deporting people and separating them from the only culture and community and language and religion that they've ever known. Number four, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. For example, like this is, I think, an interesting one conceptually. You could, let's say, you could carry out a genocide in a particular population, theoretically, by putting a contraceptive into the water, if there was such a thing, so that women drinking the water or men drinking the water in the public water supply would become sterile, and nobody would know this was happening, and then births would stop within the group. And the whole time they're wondering, what's going on? Why don't we have any births? Why is there are all of our coital acts sterile? And it turns out what is happening is a genocide, but they don't realize it. And number five is forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. The fifth one resonates with me at an emotional level as a Canadian because up until 1996, there was something called the residential school system operative in Canada. Like when I was just had finished university, the last school, the residential school, closed in Canada. And this was part of a system run between the government and Anglican and Catholic religious organizations. I believe those are the two main ones. I don't know if there were any others, where they would be part of forcibly deporting Indigenous children, First Nations children from their families and removing them, taking them to government overseen, religiously run schools that where the end goal, among other things, was to eradicate their culture, separate them from their culture and their language. You could read about something called the 60s scoop. I had students in seminary that I taught who were part of the 60s scoop. So they were removed from their families. And you'd see to this day, 50, 60 years later, the impact on these individuals. And arguably, that was part of a genocide. There's been a lot of discussion within Canada about understanding the treatment of First Nations peoples by the Canadian government and major religious groups in Canada as genocidal in the end goal and the means. So, this is what we're talking about when we talk about genocide. So, then we come to what's going on in books like Deuteronomy, Joshua, First Samuel, Numbers. And it seems to me pretty obvious that in fact, overwhelmingly clear that what is being described in those texts meets the legal definition of genocide. So, for example, Deuteronomy 7, God, Yahweh, directs the Israelites to eradicate the culture of the Canaanites, to cut down their Asherah poles, burn their temples to the ground, destroy all the visible signs of their culture. Deuteronomy 20 talks about slaughtering people within the land, the seven tribes within the land, killing everyone indiscriminately within the land, and people beyond the land, the immediate land of Canaan, killing the men or sorry, giving them the option to become enslaved. If they refuse, then kill the men and then enslave the rest of the population. I mean, this is overwhelmingly would meet a legal definition, contemporary legal definition of genocide. Go on to Joshua. You read in like Joshua chapter 6 that the entire city is surrounded, the walls are collapsed, and the Israelites go in, kill everyone, and set fire to the city. The text says, I think it's chapter 6, verse 21, that young and old were killed. So the total civilian and military population of the city is slaughtered, and then they set fire to the city. Uh, Sometimes the evangelical apologists say, yeah, but there's also this language about driving them out of the land. Okay, first of all, what that is called is ethnic cleansing. But you also have to add this. Well, and I'll just say, as I like to point out, trading one war crime or crime against humanity for another is not the own or the win that you think it is, right? You're saying, okay, it wasn't genocide, it was actually ethnic cleansing. Haha. That's not actually a win for the Christian apologist, just to let you know. But the other thing you want to keep in mind is that you have to read the total narrative. And so the total narrative describes the eradication of civilian populations within urban centers like Jericho, and then the driving out of the remaining people from the land. Cumulatively, that entire action, as well as the attempt to destroy the cultural presentation, existence of the Canaanites, as we read in Deuteronomy 7, for example, that certainly meets, again, the definition of genocide. And then you have passages like 1 Samuel 15, where in verse 3 we read explicitly that God is commanding through Samuel to Saul to kill all the Amalekites, including men, women, children, and infants, explicitly. He is directed to slaughter infants and children. And then you read in Numbers 31 to kill all the men, Midianite men and women who are non-virgins and boys, children, and take all the virgin girls, so most of whom would have been in their teens, people married young in the ancient Near East, take all the virgin girls for the army, which, because there is no concept of sexual consent under such conditions, what that is a de facto defense of sexual assault, right? Because if you are killing the family of a 15-year-old girl and then you're taking that girl and saying, ooh, after 30 days of mourning, you can now become my wife, there is no condition under which she can reasonably consent to that because of the psychological terrorism that she has just experienced. And in our contemporary understanding of consent, you have to have three criteria. This is true across legal jurisdictions in North America. You have to be able to consent, you have to consent enthusiastically, and the consent has to be ongoing throughout a sexual interaction. None of that can you have when a 15-year-old has just witnessed her family slaughtered. I mean, give me a break. So, what I'll sometimes hear apologists say is, well, you're imposing your modern conception of consent or your modern conception of genocide onto ancient Near Eastern texts, and that's anachronistic. Okay, there's a ambiguity here between two different things. Yes, it is anachronistic in the sense that they did not have those concepts accessible to them. It doesn't but that's ultimately irrelevant. The main point is that we now recognize this is what consent looks like. This is something we call genocide. It's wrong to genocide populations, and you have to have these three factors if you're going to have sexual consent. And if an apologist wants to turf the three criteria for sexual consent in the ancient Near East, when it was Midianite girls being terrorized and forced into marriages with the Israelite soldiers that slaughtered their families, then you have to consider that those same religious groups today are now going to revise consent in their day and age. And that's a pretty terrifying prospect. I could go on, but here's the thing. So if this is clearly genocide, there is no question but that what is described in Deuteronomy 7, Deuteronomy 20, Joshua 6, 1 Samuel 15, Numbers 31, all of these passages and other passages as well, would meet any reasonable legal definition and interpretation of genocide. So yes, if you are defending what the Israelites did, what happened to the Amalekites, what happened to the Canaanites and the seven tribes in the land, what happened to the Midianites, you are defending genocide. Own it. That makes you a genocide apologist. Okay, but I get that there's going to be this pushback, and so I want to talk about a couple different things I heard in Anthony's comments. First of all, when we talk about being an apologist for Action X, admittedly, there is maybe some degree of ambiguity between one who defends all instances of X and one who defends some instances of X. And I think like that's kind of like what Anthony is where he's at. Yes, he is a genocide apologist for the genocides of the Canaanites, of the Midianites, of the Amalekites, but that doesn't follow that he's a defender of contemporary genocide. He's defending some instances of genocide and not all instances of genocide. I mean, okay, but really, what are you getting there? Think about it like this. Uh, if you are an apologist for capital punishment, what you are defending is, in principle, there can be legitimate moral instances of capital punishment. It doesn't follow that you believe every instance of capital punishment is defensible or justified. You might defend capital punishment and still believe, for example, that we should not have capital punishment being carried out by the state until we have more secure legal processes to ensure that everybody gets a fair hearing and that nobody is executed while not guilty or innocent. And so you could be an apologist for capital punishment while still believing that we shouldn't have it today until we have a more thoroughly just legal system. That doesn't mean you're not an apologist for capital punishment. It just means you're a qualified apologist for capital punishment. And that's what we should then talk about is you could be an unqualified apologist for action X for all instances of X, or you'd be a qualified apologist. And the fact is that, yes, if you defend some genocides, such as the ones that happened in the ancient Near East carried out by the Israelites against the Canaanites, the Midianites, and the Amalekites, then you are a qualified apologist, but you're still an apologist. The fact that you don't believe maybe there are any ethical genocides today doesn't mean you're not an apologist for genocide. You are, and again, own it. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about, I'll put it like this: Ceteris paribus. Now, this just means all other things being equal. It's a Latin phrase, a legal term of art, which is a way of isolating one factor and saying this is a key factor. So, ceteris paribus, a qualified apologist for past instances of action X, such as genocide, that increases the likelihood that one will be or could become an apologist for current or future instances of action X. Because this is the thing that this is the I'm saying this because I want to respond to the one thing that Anthony seemed to be triggered by as well. So he was triggered, first of all, by the fact that he's a genocide apologist. Again, I think you should own it. But he's also triggered by the fact that his defense of past genocides would theoretically make him more open to future genocides. And my simple point is, in principle, yeah, it does. Certainly it does. If you have, for example, two different people, one person who believes rape could never be morally justified, and another person who believes there have been morally justified rapes in the past, but there are no morally justified rapes in the present. Between those two people, which one is more likely to become open, all other things being equal, ceteris paribus, who is the one more likely to become open to rape in the future, to defending instances of sexual assault as being morally justified? Well, clearly, all other things being equal, it's the person who recognized legitimate rapes in the past. If you believe there were moral rapes in the past, in principle, you would be the one more open in the future to moral rapes. And if you believe there have been morally justified genocides in the past, in principle, you would be more open to morally justified rapes, or sorry, genocides in the future. Now, two other things I'll say about this before I conclude. First of all, history bears this out. As one example, read Philip Jenkins' book, Lay Down the Sword, where he goes through the history of Christians defending genocides in their day based upon appealing to particular biblical texts that God had commanded and commended genocides in the past. Time and again, you see the logic at work, whether it is, for example, First Nations or Indigenous peoples of North America, whether it was the Irish during the time of Oliver Cromwell, whether it was the Muslims fleeing crusading armies in the Middle Ages. Time and again, you see the justification for biblical genocides being invoked to rationalize and justify genocides in our day. That is empirical evidence of this principle that all other things being equal, if you've defended the ethics of genocide in the past, you are more likely to be open to defending it in the future. The last example I'll give is just a simple anecdotal one. I used to work with a professor who was a pacifist, but he was a pacifist because he believed Jesus had instituted a period where the church was called to pacifism. He also believed that in the past, God had commanded the genocidal slaughters of the Canaanites, the Amalekites, and the Midianites, and he agreed and admitted when I questioned him about it that by his reading of the book of Revelation, God could command the church to abandon its pacifistic stance in the future and revert to a military stance of slaughtering God's quote unquote enemies in a future genocide, very much like the genocides of ancient Israel. There are people like that. The history shows it, as Philip Jenkins illustrates, and my own anecdotal experience shows the logic of this position that if you are open to God having committed genocide in the past, you should be open in principle, or you are more likely to be open to it in the future. Now, I'm going to conclude again. If you have not read Jesus Loves Canaanites, including Anthony Costello, I think you should read the book. I would commend it to you. It's going to go into much more depth on these issues, and in particular with a comparison of the genocide of modern Rwanda in 1994 and ancient Israel to appeal to our moral intuitions, to recognize what you are actually endorsing when you are endorsing the genocidal slaughter of populations in God's name. So check out the book, and yeah, if you are a genocide apologist, you should own it or you should retreat from your position.